Hello, everyone. We are giving everyone a few seconds to join from the waiting room. This is Sabrina Paganoni, and I'm speaking from the HEALEY ALS Center from Mass General. I'm here with our patient navigation team, Catherine Small and Alison Bullitt. So welcome, everyone. If we can go to the next slide. So today we have our regular weekly updates, and we're very excited to share updates about our trial. I also want to mention that over the next few weeks we're planning some some guest speakers as well as other topics. I recently gave a few talks, and I would like to also share them on this platform. So with general updates about the trial and kind of a recap of the results so far and what's next. But for today, we were thinking about spending most of the time to take your questions after our quick updates. So if we can go to the next slide. As a recap for everyone who may be new, we've been testing several drugs, 7 of them, in fact, using a common protocol and shared infrastructure. We already shared results from the first 4 regimens or 4 drugs. Regimen number 5, or regimen E, is ongoing. So we will have the results by the end of the year. Regimen F started enrollment, which we're very excited about, and regimen G will start enrollment very soon. Next slide. So in terms of regimen F, we're focusing on that for today because that's the regimen that's enrolling new participants. As of today, we have 46 sites that are active for regimen F. So you can always find the list of sites and the contact information by using the link and the QR code here. And then next slide. And you can always check the status of your site online by using the link and the QR code that you can see on the slide. And as a reminder, the recordings of this webinar will be posted and the slides will be downloadable, so you can always go back if you missed the QR code. And I see that Catherine is also posting a few important links in the chat. And I think, Catherine, we looked into potentially having the chat feature available in the recording. I don't know if the IT people have been able to provide any additional insights into that.
So I don't know if we've been able to figure that out, but as a workaround for the time being, we've been sharing the links and resources that we share at these webinars in the ALS link. So if anybody isn't signed up for the ALS link, that's a good way to get the embedded links from these presentations.
Perfect. That's great. That's a good point. Next slide. And so we have a number of resources. So let's look at the resources that we have for regimen F specifically. We have brochures and other information on our website. Next slide. And we also have recordings of previous webinars about the science that really supports the development of regimen F. Next slide. The regimen F will have an important biomarker component and specifically analysis of the spinal fluid. And we will have one of our colleagues, Dr. Maragakis, who was on the previous webinar here recently, will explain why that's so important in general in ALS research. So don't miss the webinar, which is next week. Next slide. And here I want to point out that Catherine and Alison are always willing to and able to connect with you outside of these webinars. And Catherine was referring to the ALS link. You can find the QR code and the link on the slide on kind of the right-hand side. So this is our newsletter where we send that we can send to people if they want to have information about some of the resources or trial information, etc. So it's not too much email. So I would definitely recommend signing up because that way you'll have all the information kind of in your inbox directly. So we can maybe keep this QR code and link up for people to take a look and note it while we take the first few questions. So there's a question about specific sites, and so the person asking is saying that their site is not going to work on this for the next few weeks until July. So yes, I'm aware of that. So so the question is, what can you do? Well, I would suggest that you talk to your physician at your site. I know that they are unable to start right now for a variety of reasons. And so depending on your specific condition and situation, it may be good for them to talk to them about either waiting or going somewhere else. And I would suggest that you talk to your physician about it. We do have other sites in your area, but at the same time, I know it's important to really first check with your team. So there's a question about the lumbar puncture. And specifically, the question is if I am having difficulty walking, if I'm having difficulties walking, can I still get a lumbar puncture? Yes, absolutely. That's definitely possible to do that. So a question about how many people have started regimen F. I actually don't remember off the top of my head, but we can definitely start providing updates as we did in the past in terms of enrollment numbers. Good point. We can get the numbers for you. So there's a question about, in general, what are the highlights of the recent meeting at AAN? So there's been a few meetings over the last scientific meetings over the last few weeks. Specifically, there was the American Academy of Neurology, or AAN, that happened last week, and then Target ALS is happening this week. And so I attended the AAN. I actually spoke at AAN, and so that's what I was referring to earlier, that I would be happy to give the same talks I gave at AAN on this platform. So we're just checking for permissions, etc. But basically, I would be happy to provide you with the same content, and those were about ALS research. I mostly attended the ALS sessions, and so just to answer your question, there were other trial results and other things about the rest of neurology that were interesting. And so for us, for ALS, I would say, we were happy to provide, again, a summary of the platform trial results. I also presented on some long-term survival data regarding AMX35. And there were a number of other talks that were quite interesting, really regrouping about the ALS clinical trial development. There was a session about, really thinking about the progress made so far. I would say that what was really striking to me is to see the number of trials for ALS that are available right now. Just to give you a sense of the scale, right now we calculated about 25 trials in phase 2 or 3 enrolling in the US, compared to, I believe it was 7 or 8 just before the pandemic. So, I would say that the progress has really been remarkable in terms of really tripling or quadrupling the number of trials that are available right now. And you need that to be able to have positive results. In other words, if you don't have many trials going on, very unlikely to have positive results. Right now, instead, we have over 20 going on. 7 of them are actually in the platform trial. So very excited about that. So the question, actually, to follow up this, so if there are so many trials, why is the platform trial testing 7 drugs and not more? Well, I mean, there's different reasons for that. The different drugs are for different subpopulations. Some are for genetically based ALS. Some are at different stages of development. For some, we need more people, more participants, fewer participants, depending on the scientific goals and the stage of development of the particular drug. I would actually say it in a positive way. It's remarkable that we have 7 in the platform trial, and so we can make progress fast on those, and it's good that there's also separate trials. That's not negative either. I mean, it's good that there's many that are ongoing at the same time. So there was a question about SOD1. And the question is SOD1 ALS due to a genetic cause? Yeah, so and the question is whether there may be other causes, other things that affect SOD1 ALS. So I would say that for SOD1 ALS, there is clearly a genetic trigger or a genetic cause. That said, other things may happen as a secondary event. And so I think that it makes sense to also use a cocktail or combination of drugs, including the currently available drugs, for people who have genetically based ALS. So there's a few more questions about how come that we have so many trials right now? How did the big increase happen? Was it increase in funding or other things? So, so I would say, I think this is a very important question. And I want to say what I said at the AAN, and then again, I'm happy to bring back the presentation and talk about this. But so first of all, there's certainly increase in funding that has happened. I would say that the Ice Bucket Challenge really helped catalyze the field in terms of interest, in terms of, researchers, fellows, trainees going into ALS, because now ALS, was put on the map, and that really mattered. So I do want to say that all the advocacy and fundraising and all the efforts that so many in the community have done, including I'm sure many people who are on the call today, really made a big impact, that for sure. And so the funding was, not just from that, but funding from different sources. And now obviously we have more federal funding thanks to many advocacy efforts as well, Act for ALS and other things. So I think it's really increased in funding from several sources that has continued to grow. That's incredibly important. And I think that it should really continue to grow, because that really leads to more knowledge and more trials. The other thing that I think happened is that there's been some advances. Sometimes it's hard to see the progress when you're in the middle of it, but when we look back, like the number of genetic causes of ALS that have been discovered and the models that have been developed based on that. Also outside ALS, we know that researchers developed ways to create stem cells from somebody's body. So induced pluripotent stem cells, it actually led to a Nobel Prize for Medicine a few years ago. And so that technique is now being used in ALS and many other neurodegenerative diseases. So I think that those kind of just advances in technology and knowledge also obviously continue to lead to an increased number of trials. I would say that also the interest from companies and really the collaborative nature of ALS academic centers and the ALS patient community, that really helped. So I would say that all of this has really been great. And somebody made a comment about, are there other disease areas that are doing this? Well, I would say, and again, I'll bring the slides another time from that talk, but essentially one amazing aspect of working on this trial is that a number of other disease areas, spinal cord injury, Alzheimer's, etc., they started contacting us and they are setting up platform trials in their space. So I think all this knowledge that's been generated is helpful to many. So question about the EAP for Regimen E. So the EAP for Regimen E is going to include 25 sites. And the question is, why does it take time for the sites to get up and running? And this is because it's run as a real clinical trial. It's basically, it's really the legislation called for funding for really research through EAPs, and that's what we're doing. And unfortunately, that takes time in terms of the contracting with the sites, etc. I can assure that we are really doing everything we can to do that. So question about the specific participant, I would encourage you to connect separately with Catherine by email. And so essentially, there's the question is trial options for your relative. So thank you so much for participating on this webinar on behalf of your relative. And in terms of whether this person may be eligible or not, I would recommend that you reach out to Catherine. I think, Catherine, if you can post your email or phone number. Oh, you just did. Thank you so much. So that maybe we can see if there's other options. There's also, again, EAPs could also be an option if not eligible for the trial. There's a good question about what are the criteria to decide whether to include a drug in the platform trial. Well, that's a combination of reasons. First of all, the science, I would say that's number one. And there's a group or a therapy evaluation committee that looks at the science. This is a committee that includes several scientists with a lot of expertise in ALS. And so the number one criterion is the science. And then there's additional criteria related to whether a drug is a good fit for the trial in terms of drug availability, stage of funding, safety studies in previous ALS studies, or other disease areas. So there's a number of additional criteria that are used. But we want to bring some of our scientists on this call. I know Catherine has been trying to schedule that, but we will as soon as we are able to schedule. All right. There's a question about sharing the link for the webinar on Monday. Catherine, would you mind putting it in the chat? And for everyone else who's watching the recording again, you can sign up for the ALS link to receive that directly, or you can look at any of the recent slides and recordings from this webinar that are on our website, and you can get it back from there. Question about the status of some of the regimens, C and D. So C and D, we have results, and those results are helping the companies now move the drugs forward to a separate phase 3 trial. So that's the status of that. So there's a good question about progressive supranuclear palsy, PSP, and the question is whether FTD or PSP, different neurodegenerative disease spaces, if they've been in contact with us. Yes, in fact they have, and so we have shared a lot with both groups, PSP and FTD. I think there's excellent experts there, and I really hope that they can have their own platform trial. There's a question about whether, how to choose a trial, really. That's the core of the question. And specifically, somebody's asking about choosing between regimen F in the platform trial or a separate study that's going on at your site. So I would say that, first of all, I agree with you in terms of discussing that with your physician. I think that's always the way to start. You talk to the people that are following you clinically to get a recommendation in terms of the specifics of the situation, simply because some eligibility criteria or some clinical aspects of the trial may make a trial a good fit for one person and not for another, for example, in terms of travel requirements or procedures or schedules, etc. So I think that's always a good starting point. In terms of whether deciding to do one trial or another based on the science, which I think is what you're also asking. I mean, I think that, to be honest with you, that's very hard to do, because the reality is that we don't know if any of these drugs work. So I'm unable to tell you, well, I think this drug is more promising than this other one, because again, we have some preliminary data, but until we do the trials, it's hard to know. So again, I would just look at what makes the most sense, sort of logistically and clinically for you, and I would go with that. And that's the way I discuss this, I think. I don't know. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to write them in the chat. So I think I took all of the questions so far. There were a couple of questions that were sent in advance, so perhaps I can quickly take that. So one question is about regimen C, CNM AU8, and the question is about the results from regimen C of the platform trial, and what we think about the EAP that's now going on. So I think it's very good that the company is doing separate projects. So specifically, obviously, they're taking the results of the platform trial to plan their phase 3 study, and also including all the learnings as they do their expanded access program. So I think it's great that that's happening. And I think that the one of the the two learnings really that we had from the trial for that specific drug is that with the regimen C of the platform trial, we learned what the right dose is, which is the one that's being moved forward, obviously. And also we learned that the drug may take a long time just based on the mechanism of action of that particular drug to have an effect. So I think that looking at outcomes long-term for that particular drug is really a good way to go. And I'm glad the company is doing that. Questions about upcoming regimens. Again, we'll provide enrollment numbers for regimen F. Regimen G has not started enrollment yet, but that should happen anytime. I think next week we have the big investigator meetings. And so, you know, that's they're going to start after that. There's a question about eligibility criteria, and the question is are there exceptions for criteria if somebody doesn't meet one specific criteria, for example, vital capacity? And so no, unfortunately, there are no exceptions in this type of regulatory trials, and that's really because exceptions would actually affect the sort of, you know, the results of the trial. And so unfortunately, in this sort of large-scale trials, FDA regulated, where the data could be used for the registration, unfortunately, we cannot grant exceptions. But that's also the motivation for doing expanded access protocols, right? That's exactly for that, to allow people who don't fit the criteria to have other options. Question about Medicare, if Medicare is covering the two new drugs. I think you are referring to Radicava, Relivio, or potentially Tofersen. I believe that that's what the question is asking. I mean, I think that there's ways definitely for people to have those medications reimbursed. It takes time, and it's a process, not just for Medicare, for any insurance. There's a question about if I know anything new about Neuron. I actually don't. And question in advance again, what types of drugs are you looking to add to the trial? Well, we continuously talk to scientists, experts, companies, really looking for the drugs with the best science. And we certainly are already in conversations with a number of people trying to select their drugs when the time is right. Again, sometimes it's not that the science is not ready. In fact, there's many exciting drugs from a scientific perspective. Sometimes it's more manufacturing or permissions or funding or things like that. So certainly we are having a lot of conversations, and hopefully when the time is right for all these drugs and other things fall into place, we'll include them. There's a question about whether there will be an EAP for regimen F. So we are in conversations with the company, and so certainly those conversations have started. I hope that will happen. Question about the difference between familial ALS and genetic ALS. Well, I'm glad you're asking the question. I don't think the field has really come to consensus yet, but essentially, sort of the historical way of the kind of more traditional nomenclature is familial ALS, meaning ALS that happens in families when there is a genetic mutation that's actually the cause of the disease. So for example, if there is one person with SOD1 ALS, chances are that other people in the family may have it too. And so it runs in families, and therefore it's called familial. Now, more recently, I would say over the last 5-10 years, we have recognized that there are many people, not many, about 10% of people with ALS that don't have any relative that has ALS, but they still have a genetic cause for their ALS. And there are many reasons for that. So for example, it could be that, many of these genes don't express themselves until a certain age. So it's possible, for example, that perhaps parents or relatives may have died before they would have developed ALS, and so they didn't know that they were, predisposed to that. Or it's possible that some genes may not manifest in everyone. So there are some genes that have so-called low penetrance or reduced penetrance, where, even if you carry the gene, for whatever reason, somebody may never develop the disease. That's possible in medicine in general. Or again, there's many reasons why somebody who has a genetic cause of ALS may not have relatives affected. And so because of that reason, the nomenclature is now sort of transitioning from the more classic familial to genetic, recognizing that sometimes, you know, people can be the first in their family to be identified, for example. And so not having any relative doesn't necessarily mean that there's no genetic cause of the disease. The other big breakthrough came in 2011 when C9 was discovered, and that particular gene can actually be connected to different diseases, for example, frontotemporal dementia or FTD. So what that means is that, for example, let's say in the same family, you could have somebody with FTD or some sort of Alzheimer's, things that are called Alzheimer's, but it's really FTD. So perhaps it's not recognized as FTD, but really it's C9 related cognitive problems, and somebody else in the family who has the same gene instead will not develop that, but will develop ALS. So there's many reasons why kind of, you know, there's many different situations, and that's why the field is still trying to come up with the best term. And the question about what if another relative had ALS, but the genetic tests are negative. So I think you're referring to the fact that sometimes ALS may run in families, but we are unable to identify the gene. So if that's your question right now, so two in the same family. So right now we know a lot of genes, but we don't know all the genes that cause ALS. So even when we use the most recent and comprehensive genetic screening panel, we can only detect about 70% of the genetic causes of ALS, simply because we have not discovered the other 30%. And so that could be a reason for having, you know, two people in the same family with the disease, but no genetic cause identified. There's a question about, and somebody said, could this be coincidental? Well, I mean, it could be. There's actually rare cases where two different mutations have been identified in the same family. And so again, there's many different scenarios. It could also be coincidental, absolutely. There's been actually some case reports of husband and wife who were not related biologically, developing ALS, etc., and that could be coincidental. Obviously, people have asked about exposure, but again, there's many things that we don't know yet. There's a question about somebody having a relative with lupus, which is an autoimmune disease in the family, and the question is this related to ALS? Well, I just want to be careful here, and so not directly. So we don't have a gene that can cause lupus and ALS. I do want to say that, just for full disclosure, there is a slight increase in the incidence of specific diseases in the ALS population. So, but that doesn't mean that it's the cause. I mean, it's finding associations in big databases that some diseases, like autoimmune diseases, are more prevalent, relatively speaking, in families with ALS, doesn't mean that there is the same genetic cause. There are associations that we don't fully understand. Question, let me see. The question is if I know of any study where there are really remarkable results, like reversals, for example, of ALS. So I don't know of any at this time that really led to disease reversal. So I would say that, that would be something that definitely people would be paying a lot of attention to if this, again, were to be sort of replicated several times with several reversals. But certainly, that's something that people are continuing to monitor and pay attention to. I don't know if there's any other questions, Catherine or Alison, or did we? I think we took all of them. Okay. Thank you so much, and we'll see everyone again next week. Thank you.